I was curious about what it was like to be an amputee when I was working as a vascular surgeon.
What it's like to be on the other side of the knife.
I didn't realise how frustrating it was for patients.
People, YouTubers, Instagrammers, etc. Achievement pornography.
Yesterday, I just looked and felt disabled.
All expenses paid, trip to Salford.
It's not easy being an amputee, not at all, but also, it's not too bad.
Today, we'll be discussing the case of Neil Hopper. It's April 2019. Neil was out camping with his family when suddenly he fell ill. As the night went on, he could not stop throwing up. Even after going home, he had a fever and felt very lethargic. But what started off as what appeared to be a stomach bug soon turned into a fight for his life. Because after calling the night and going to bed early, the only thing Neil could remember is waking up in the ICU, surrounded by nothing but concerned doctors. This illness was far more complex than just a stomach bug. Something was very wrong with Neil's legs, to the point the tissue in his legs were deteriorating day by day. And with how badly damaged they ended up becoming, doctors were left with no choice but to perform a double amputation. This story spread all over. Neil was named the bravest man in Britain, and many were inspired by his sheer determination and unreal accomplishments he achieved throughout this experience. But what many didn't know was that behind that smile of a courageous and hopeful man lied a twisted and depraved secret he had been hiding from everyone. One so twisted, it was unfathomable even to the most experienced investigators. When news broke of this secret, many were left horrified, fearing that they might have been an unknowing victim of this man's depraved scheme. And what the police would uncover during their investigation will only make you question, what more had Neil been hiding? But before we get into this case, just to introduce myself, my name is Petal Palmer, and on this channel I post anything medical, mysteries, and crime. If that is something that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. Alright, let's get into this case. For many, Easter is a holiday where families are able to come together to enjoy each other's presence. Those who are religious are able to go to church. People might have a chocolate Easter egg hunt, and families might even take trips to see relatives or just have a nice family vacation. This was the reality for the Hopper family around Easter in April 2019. The Hopper family consisted of 2 children, a 10-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son, as well as parents, 42-year-old Rachel and 43-year-old Neil. Born in March of 1976 to parents Clive and Anne, who were both nurses, Neil grew up in the uplands area of Swansea, Wales. With Welsh being his second language, he attended the Welsh medium secondary school, Ysgol Gyfun Gwe, and he attended Landovery College. In August of 1997, Neil attended the University of Wales in Cardiff to study anatomical sciences and biosciences. It was after graduating in August of 2000 when Neil began studying at the University of Wales School of Medicine. And after more than a decade of studies and training, he officially became a medical doctor. Specifically, he became a surgeon. In 2011, he worked at the Royal Gwent Hospital in Newport, Wales for general surgery training. Then it was in February of 2013 when Neil got a position as a consultant vascular surgeon at the Royal Cornwall Hospital's NHS Trust in the city of Truro in Cornwall, England. Cornwall is the southernmost county in England, being surrounded by 3 sides of water, the English Channel, Atlantic Ocean, and the Celtic Sea. It is well known for its steep cliffs, rivers, and hundreds of beaches along its beautiful coastlines. With its world-renowned beaches, it's considered the UK's surfing capital, and it's one of the leading holiday or vacation destinations in the country. But in addition to its beautiful waters, Truro, which is actually Cornwall's only city, contains a lot of historical buildings and street markets, while also being surrounded by woodlands for river walks and foresty adventures. It wasn't uncommon for the Hoppers to go on trips in the surrounding forested areas. During that April of 2019, the family decided to go on a camping trip in one of Cornwall's woodlands. Initially, this trip started out just fine. However, it was a little bit later during that night on that first day when both Neil and his daughter started feeling very sick. Both Neil and his daughter had a fever, and they were vomiting throughout the night. So as soon as morning time came, the family decided to gather up their stuff and just go home. Once they got home, for the next couple of days, they just rested and took it easy. It didn't take too long for his daughter to start feeling better and for symptoms to clear up for her. However, Neil still felt sick. He still felt as though he had a fever, he still felt lethargic, and he was just not getting any better. This was a big problem because the family had actually planned to go visit the parents of his wife that week. But after his daughter fully recovered and Neil did not, he and the family figured that he must have just had a stomach bug. And so Rachel and the children just ended up traveling up country to visit her parents while Neil stayed home. Now, the day after the family left without Neil, he actually began feeling a little bit better. He still felt tired, but he thought he was improving, so he was quite optimistic. Despite this, however, later that day, his shoulders and feet began aching. And with this, he just thought, okay, I'll take a paracetamol, have a glass of whiskey tonight, and I'll go to bed early. He officially shut his eyes for the night. But when he woke up, things only took a turn for the worst. That next day, Neil's wife, Rachel, called him on the phone. But when Neil picked up, he was speaking very incoherently. The words he was saying were not making sense whatsoever, and Rachel knew that something was wrong. Immediately after, Rachel ended up contacting one of her colleagues who lived nearby named Rachel B. And she told Rachel B, like, hey, my husband Neil sounds like he's not doing too well. Would you please be able to head to our house so you can check up on him? Rachel B agreed to do this and soon left for the Hopper family home to check on Neil. Fortunately, Neil had left the door open, and so Rachel B was easily able to get inside. But when she saw Neil, she immediately called an ambulance. Neil was struggling to stay awake and his blood pressure was extremely low. In fact, it was so bad he didn't even remember any of this happening. He only had flashes of recollection, but he wasn't even sure if these were even reliable. All he concretely remembered from this time was going to sleep that night after his glass of whiskey and waking up in the intensive care unit, or ICU, at the Royal Cornwall Hospital. This was the very hospital he worked at in Truro. When he got to the hospital, they immediately hooked him up to IV fluids and antibiotics, and fortunately, this actually helped him improve relatively quickly. However, something that was still affecting him were his feet. His feet were hurting, and Neil thought that they were in serious trouble, which he was absolutely right about because his feet were in serious condition. In fact, he was on the verge of losing them because it turns out Neil didn't just have a stomach bug, because instead he had developed sepsis. This is, quote, a life-threatening emergency that happens when your body's response to an infection damages vital organs and often causes death. Doctors looked at all of their options, but there was nothing that could have been done surgically to improve the circulation or blood supply to his feet. Eventually, they determined that the only way they'd be able to save his feet were if they had him do emergency oxygen therapy. Specifically, he was going to be doing hyperbaric oxygen therapy. This is a method of treating wounds and other medical conditions by supplying somebody with 100% oxygen inside a highly pressurized chamber. This therapy is well known for treating scuba divers and deep sea divers who are affected by the rapid change in pressure around them, but it's also used to treat various other health problems, including carbon monoxide poisoning, gangrene, wounds that won't heal, and many more. Every single day for 2 weeks straight, Neil would have to go into the highly pressurized chamber to breathe in 100% oxygen for 3 hours at a time. These sessions he referred to as dives. Problem is, this treatment was not available in Cornwall. The nearest place it was available was about 95 kilometers away at the Diving Diseases Research Center, or DDRC, also known as the Hyperbaric Medical Center unit in Plymouth. So they transferred him over there. With the chamber being clear, typically patients are able to watch TV during their treatments. However, Neil wore glasses because he was nearsighted. And the thing with this is that glasses and contacts weren't allowed inside the chamber. So for the entirety of the treatment, he just had to lay there with nothing but his thoughts. Between those dives, he was brought right over to the Derryford Hospital, where he was cared for by consultant vascular surgeons Mr. Francis Dix and Commander Christopher Perry. These were two surgeons that he had actually known professionally, and they did what whatever they could do to make sure he was well looked after. They really wanted to make sure that Neil's feet were saved, and they were doing anything and everything they could pull to get this to happen. But a couple of days turned to a couple of weeks, and it was very clear that the hyperbaric oxygen treatment they were doing was not working. The care team met amongst themselves, and after a lot of discussion, they thought that maybe if they removed his toes, this could allow his feet to heal. So they performed an operation in which they removed Neil's toes. But contrary to what they hoped, his feet still continued to deteriorate. And the only thing this procedure did was make the doctors realize that the situation was a lot worse than they expected. For the next week, they had multiple plastic surgeons come down to see Neil to figure out if there was something they could do to save his feet. The great news from this was that there was a possibility they would actually be able to save his left foot. But the bad news was this process would have involved several operations, and there was the potential that the results would not be good. With how he was doing, eventually doctors made a very big decision. They came to his room and they told Neil, "Hey, I'm sorry to say this, but you're going to need to have your lower legs amputated." Neil soon had discussions with various surgeons and the prosthetics department, trying to figure out if he would need to get just one side amputated or both, because having both sides amputated could be a much more difficult outcome. They told him that they can't predict the outcome, but with him being young, even if he were to get both sides amputated, there was a good chance the outcome would be a good one. And so Neil opted to have both of his legs amputated below the knee. Although he understood intellectually that this needed to happen, he was in shock. He described that the thought of power tools being used on him was icky and really weird. He performed thousands of amputations on others in his career, but having this happen to himself was something he never expected, and it didn't feel real to him. It was only sometime in May when Neil was brought a consent form to sign the day before the operation was planned, and it was then when it truly clicked that this was going to be happening. This day before the operation was actually his wife's birthday, and during that very evening, Neil, for the first time ever, suffered a panic attack. He could not breathe. He felt like there was a very large weight on his chest, and he just could not stop thinking about what was soon going to happen. Although he knew it was a panic attack, he said he wasn't able to rationalize himself out of it. He felt that he had lost complete control, and this was incredibly frightening for him as it was something he had never felt before. That next day, Neil had the operation performed by Mr. Francis Dix and Commander Christopher Perry, and almost immediately after waking up, Neil felt physically better. His energy levels were up, things felt much brighter, and he was on the road to recovery. He stayed in the hospital for about a week or so after the operation, and after that, he was discharged and sent on his way home.
I've made it home, and I'm now in the dull period between discharge from hospital and getting my legs. So I'm currently just killing time, waiting to be fitted with prosthetics so that I can get back to living as normal a life as possible.
He had been in the hospital for about 6 to 7 weeks, but this was only the start of a very long recovery period for him. While he felt relatively fine during his stay at the hospital, when he came home, this took a complete change. He had gotten so used to being cared for by nurses and healthcare assistants that being back on his own, missing 2 of his lower legs, was difficult. Neil found it difficult to not be able to work as he recovered, as he described that for him, doing surgery wasn't a job, but it was a vocation, describing, quote, "If you cut me in half, it would read Neil Hopper, vascular surgeon." Being a vascular surgeon involves a lot of standing up to perform the operations, but Neil was unsure if he would even be able to walk well again, and he began having doubts of whether he would be able to return to work or not. In order to move around, Neil had to use a wheelchair, but for those first 3 weeks out of the hospital, he didn't have a ramp installed at his house, so he was left with no choice but to stay inside. This began to affect him because he wasn't getting enough physical activity, and it was through this when he said he began to realize that the system wasn't as flexible as it should have been regarding taking into account differences in people's age or ability. Neil said that he became pretty low and depressed because as part of his physiotherapy while he was in the hospital, he would go to the gym every hour, but when he was sent home, all he was given were photocopied exercise sheets designed for patients who were elderly. These were what he described as, quote, very easy and boring. In Cornwall, there wasn't a specialized physiotherapist who focused on amputees, so Neil's wife Rachel got in contact with a private physiotherapist in Plymouth, and after meeting up with him, Neil was extremely pleased. Additionally, a colleague of his brought him to a local gym called Morgan's Gym in Truro. At this gym, there was a rehab personal trainer, and Neil enjoyed his time there and started really improving. After being fitted, it was about 4 months after the operation in late August when Neil received prosthetic legs. Having his prosthetic legs helped him start feeling more optimistic, and it didn't take too long for him to get used to walking with them. It was estimated to take 3 months for him to be able to comfortably walk with them, but Neil was able to do this in just 3 hours. This was likely in part because of the exercises he had been doing to get stronger. By October, he had progressed so quickly, he already felt like he was ready to return back to work. But getting there was nowhere near easy. He had a pretty frustrating time during rehabilitation and even thought that he must have been a nightmare patient because he wasn't too pleased with certain services not being available that he believed should have been. While he said that he already knew that NHS staff were universally amazing, this idea was only reinforced from how he was treated. He described that every practitioner he encountered during his recovery were all really good at their jobs and were hardworking. Not just this, but the treatment he received from the therapeutic team while in the hospital, including healthcare assistants, the physio assistants, and even the catering staff, made the experience for him far better than he could have expected. However, he complained that everything took too long, the interactions were too short, they weren't frequent enough, and there were gaps in the care. Just adding to this, as mentioned, there were no rehabilitation specialists in Cornwall who looked after patients with prosthetics, so this required him to travel over an hour away to Plymouth to be treated at a rehabilitation facility called the Thornbury Centre. And a very important example that he brought up was the fact that there was no ready access to a psychologist at the rehabilitation center. This was something he especially thought about in retrospect because while he was able to make it through, quote, anger and depression, he believes that it would have been easier to do this had he had input from a counselor or psychologist. He had put so much emphasis on his physical recovery that he didn't really take the time for his psychological recovery, and he didn't take time to process everything. He described, quote, I do not think any surgeon really understands what it is like for a patient to have an amputation. I understood it on an intellectual level, but oh boy, did I not have the first clue of what it is like. It changes absolutely everything. It changes the way you interact with the environment, it changes the way you are seen by other people, and it changes the way you see yourself. I learned an awful lot about myself through this. I learned that I was more resilient and stubborn than I had imagined. I also learned that I could be impatient and downright indignant. I learned that as a patient, you sometimes have to push to get the best care. He, for the first time, experienced phantom pain. This is when someone feels pain in their missing body part after an amputation. Likewise, he experienced the effects of the different drugs. One of the pain management medications he took, called pregabalin, made him feel thick-headed, and he said he felt as if treacle, which is an almost molasses-like syrup, was being poured into his brain.
I'm on pregabalin and duloxetine, and that seems to have got them sorted, although it does make me feel like somebody's poured treacle in my brain. My memory's gone to pot, and I do feel a little bit, not confused, but I can't keep things in my head. So I'll give you an example. So before, if somebody were to tell me a phone number, I pretty much remember it straight away, but how I can manage a few digits. So I'm putting that down too.
The thing that gabapentin does, it just numbs you, but not just numbs you from a pain point of view, it just numbs every part of you. You just don't care about things. Things just wash over you, and it slows your brain down so much. It felt like somebody had opened my skull and poured treacle in.
He experienced how amputees were a close-knit, friendly, and helpful community, even making many new friends with those who understood what he was going through. That being said, he also experienced the disparities faced by amputees in the community. According to a February 2020 Cornwall Live article, at the time, there were about 900 amputees in Cornwall with prosthetic limbs. However, there were far more amputees there who weren't well enough to get them fitted. He believed that amputees weren't given enough resources after they leave the hospital compared to other patient groups. Specifically, he said that if cancer patients were to receive such lack of support, it would be seen as a national disgrace. As mentioned, he considered himself a nightmare patient because he was aware of everything that should have been happening.
Once I was off the gut pit, and I think that's when the world really sort of became real, and my predicament became real, and my frustrations and anger sort of bubbled to the surface. I just realised that the stuff I'd been told in hospital was nobody lied to me, but the time frames and expectations were just wrong. Somebody tells you you're going to have legs in 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and it turns out to be 10 weeks or 12 weeks. That doesn't sound like a lot of time difference, but it feels like forever when you're sat at home. The days last for weeks and the weeks last for months. So it's really frustrating. And when somebody says, you get your casting on a Thursday and you get your legs on a Monday, but in actual fact it turns out to be a month later, it's really annoying.
Because he saw and experienced these imbalances in the treatment, he made it his mission to address this, to try to make improvements for what amputees in Cornwall were experiencing, stating, quote, "Just by shining a light on it and getting people talking, I'm hoping to improve things." And he was successful in making some minor changes fairly quickly. By February of 2020, he was able to get the hospital to give amputees information packs to leave the hospital with. He made sure there were 2 nurse practitioners that provided their numbers to patients in case they had any inquiries when they went home. And he even managed to get the Prosthetics Rehabilitation Center in Plymouth to employ a student psychologist. He described himself as never being athletic or not being the most nimble or physically fit, but he was able to dance with his prosthetic legs. He would ride on a hoverboard. He would even run. He played sports with his children. He went on long walks with them, and he even partook in a lot of hobbies. So Neil used his experience to tell his patients, look, I understand what you're going through. These are the difficulties I faced. You will definitely get through this. In his words, quote, "There's also nothing quite like popping a leg off for them so they can see how everything works." During recovery, Neil had a few sudden, unexpected moments where the reality of everything would actually hit him. But eventually in October, when he was able to go back to work and see his friends, colleagues, and patients, this helped him with being able to come to terms with everything and get back into his normal life. Initially, some surgeons said he would be fine, while other surgeons said he might have to think about changing some aspects of the work he was doing. For example, instead of standing up to perform surgeries, he could probably do more research and paperwork. This was hard for him to hear, but when reflecting on it, Neil stated, quote, "I wanted to prove that they were completely wrong. Throughout my career, I'd always tried to imagine what it was like to have an amputation, so I didn't expect to get the answer. You all have a chance to see what it's like on the other side of the knife."
So when I met with the prosthetist, they thought that my aspirations were too aspirational, if that makes sense. But I think if you aim for the stars and hit the moon, that's fine, and that's what my feeling about it is. I'm going to try and do my best to do as much as possible, and if I can do that, great, and if I can't, well, so be it. But I think I'll get there. I'm pretty confident.
They gave a plan of a phased return where he would start off with physically easier tasks and work up to harder ones. He initially started back up by working in clinics and doing paperwork, but over time, he gradually worked back up to performing operations and taking some on-calls. By February of 2020, 10 months after his feet were amputated, Neil was back to doing full duties and taking full-on calls. This was something he described he never could have imagined being able to achieve, and coincidentally, the first procedure he performed when back was an amputation. That being said, he returned back to full duties at work around the time COVID-19 hit the UK, so hospitals undoubtedly were extremely busy. Neil felt like this was a time the hospital truly needed him, so he was determined to keep working. This ended up turning into a lot of interactions with patients over the phone, which made things easier for him energy-wise. It also meant the amount of elective surgeries performed were reduced, and it also meant his colleagues were more easily available had he needed any help. When the public began hearing about what happened to Neil, everyone was extremely intrigued about his story. News articles began getting posted about him, and Neil even started his own social media pages sharing his story and progress updates. He started a Facebook and YouTube page in November of 2019, just 7 months after the amputation. It was on his Facebook page where he went by the name Bionic Surgeon. His LinkedIn bio was changed to, quote, somewhat legless vascular surgeon. Likewise, he also began a website with the name bionicsurgeon.net. This website was extremely organized. He had a very unique tagline, 12% plastic and metal, 100% WTF happened. He had different categories for amputee information. He had a blog section. He would link his YouTube videos, pictures, contact links. Everyone was so touched by Neil's story. It was very inspirational to see a surgeon go through something so horrific but be able to return pretty closely back to his normal life. It was touching to see him advocate for patients and continue performing amputations himself as an amputee. He was interviewed by very big radio and news platforms, including This Morning and the BBC. In 2020, he even won an Amplifon Award for Brave Britons in the Against All Odds category. Neil continued being named as one of the first amputees to do some very specific things. Not only was he highlighted as an amputee who performs amputations, but he was also looking to be the world's first person with a physical disability to go to space on an assigned mission. In February of 2021, the European Space Agency, for the first time in over a decade, was looking to fill a new astronaut position as part of their para-astronaut feasibility project. They were looking for a para-astronaut with 3 requirements. 1, the person had to have a doctorate degree in either engineering and medicine. 2, they needed to have a disability below the knee. And 3, they needed to speak a second language. Neil not only spoke English, but he also spoke Welsh, so he met all 3 of these requirements. And being someone who's always been interested in space himself, he immediately applied in December of 2021 after seeing this ad. Neil's wife, Rachel, thought he was absolutely crazy for going for this, but he was very excited for the possible opportunity. To his fortune, Neil actually made the shortlist for this position. If he were to get the position, he would be the second Welsh-speaking man in space behind Canadian Welsh astronaut David Rhys-Williams. Neil had gotten so far in the application process that he actually began worrying, what if he was selected and didn't return from space? And he jokingly stated, quote, my wife was interested in what the insurance payout would be if the rocket blew up. And as I read that, there's a bit of foreshadowing right there. This, however, though, was not going to be reality for him, because unfortunately, after a test phase in Hamburg, he was informed by the European Space Agency that they wouldn't be going forward with his application. In November of 2022, they instead selected British Paralympian and orthopedic surgeon John McFall to be the first para-astronaut. Nonetheless, Neil's story was so exciting that a Welsh channel called S4C created a documentary with a title I cannot pronounce, following his recruitment journey. This documentary aired on Sunday, February 26, 2023 on BBC iPlayer and other platforms. While many expected Neil to go on as the amputee surgeon, publicly sharing his story and inspiring the world, to his surprise, this documentary would actually be the last high before everything turned south. Within just weeks of this documentary airing, in March of 2023, Neil was suspended from his job at the Royal Cornwall Hospital NHS Trust. Just a month after that, in April, restrictions were placed on his practice by the Medical Practitioners Tribunal Service as the General Medical Council conducted an investigation on him, and by December of 2023, Neil was officially suspended from the medical register. Because it wasn't too long after when investigators received a tip and they discovered that there may be a disturbing secret Neil was hiding regarding the truth behind his amputation. But before we can even understand any of that, we're going to have to go back to February of 2022 when the community of North London was shocked to learn about 7 local men arrested after running an illegal castration ring. In December of 2021, a house in the Finsbury Park neighborhood of London was raided by police for a total of 4 days. And after their findings, it was in February of 2022 when 7 men were arrested, because it was discovered that these men were using the basement of the house to surgically remove men's private areas and perform castrations. In fact, these castrations weren't just done privately in the basement, but they were rather filmed and broadcasted for pay-per-view TV. By the way, I'll be saying the word private areas or private parts because YouTube is sometimes weird mentioning certain words depending on the context it's used in. Sometime around October of 2011, a man by the name of Marius Gustavson emigrated from Norway to the seaside resort town of Bournemouth in the UK. Born on Tuesday, July 12, 1977, Marius graduated from a business school in the city of Drummond in 1996. Very shortly after this, he went to the UK to study at a language school in Hastings, East Sussex, where he earned an English certificate. And for the years following that, Marius moved between Norway and the UK, doing just a bunch of random jobs. For example, in 2000, he resided at a seaside resort town in England called Torquay, working as a receptionist at a 3-star hotel called Abbey Lawn. In Norway, Marius actually had several run-ins with the law regarding fraud. In 1999, he was sentenced to 75 days imprisonment, suspended for 2 years, and in 2001, he received a partially suspended 8-month sentence. It was after this conviction in 2001 when Marius found work in Norway's postal service, and he worked there for an entire decade. During those years, not only was he working, but he was taking part in a lot of activism. In Buskerud, he served as a regional chairman of Norway's LLH, which was once the largest LGBT group in the country and is now known today as the FRI. Marius's ex-husband stated that he was looked up to by many fellow charity workers in Norway. Likewise, his friends and colleagues described him as being a regular colleague and a private and even lonely person who dedicated his spare time for the activism he did. A former member of the LLH named Camilla Loken even described him as a nice guy and a big teddy bear. After working at the Norwegian Postal Service for those 10 years, around October of 2011, when Marius was 34 years old, he made his move to Bournemouth to work as a customer care service manager at Xerox. And after working there for 4 years, it was in 2015 when he moved to the neighborhood of Finsbury Park in North London. While on the outside looking in, he seemed like a very normal person, what people didn't know was that Marius had his own absurd interests, to describe lightly. And this move was just the start of what was to be several years of an underground castration ring. On Sunday, January 14th, 2018, Marius started a website called eunuchmaker.com, and it was on this very website where he would advertise body modification services, including male castration and private area removal. But before the website even started, Marius had already started doing these procedures on others. And worst of it all was he wasn't alone in doing this. Rather, he had a team of 6 different men helping him with this. They would assist Marius in doing these procedures, and there's video of Marius directing and encouraging them throughout. By the way, he called himself the Eunuch Maker because a eunuch refers to, quote, a castrated man who historically served in roles within royal courts across the Middle East and Asia. This is a practice which dates back to at least 2000 BCE, in which males had their reproductive organs removed, typically before puberty and often against their own will. It is also a practice that continued in later years in different places as well, such as the Ottoman Empire, which had black eunuchs from Africa and white eunuchs from Europe work in what is now known as modern-day Turkey. The term eunuch derives from the Greek word eunuchos, which combines elements that mean keeper of the bed. These procedures were done with the intent of preparing individuals for a life of service, watching over royal harems and families, as it was thought that by them not being able to procreate, they were less of a threat to take over the king's rule by having their own children, especially with the king's family. In some cases, though, this was done to adult men as a form of punishment, and in others, this was done for religious reasons. In this context, it's a practice that still continues today, but the historical use of working with royal families was abolished in China in 1924, with the last imperial eunuch, Sun Yat-sen, passing away in 1996. In a video on his computer from Saturday, June 24th, 2017, Marius was seen taking a severed male private part and putting it in his mouth. And only just a year after that, in June of 2018, there are images in which there was preparation for lunch and cooking of what looked to be human testicles, which were then plated and eaten. And it was the following year when Marius thought it'd be best to dedicate a website to content like this. On his website, Marius would advertise these services of extreme body modification, including the male castration and private area removal, despite not having medical training and certifications to perform these procedures. And for the people who did seek these services, a lot of the procedures were filmed and posted for paying subscribers of the website. And these weren't just webcam, low-quality videos, because over time, the videos began getting produced at a very professional level, and they were posted under the banner Eunch Maker / Nullset Productions. These procedures were performed not only at Marius's home, but also at hotels or rented places. And on this site, the paid subscriptions were in essentially a tier format where users could pay for different kinds of annual subscriptions and could also pay for additional access to videos. Likewise, it had a social media format where subscribers were able to chat amongst themselves. Even though the people in the video technically consented, not only was it still illegal for Marius to perform these operations unqualified, but a lot of the victims he had done this to were extremely vulnerable, especially due to things like age, personal characteristics, or circumstances. It was stated that a lot of them had gender dysphoria or body dysmorphia. Gender dysphoria refers to, quote, distress due to a discrepancy between one's assigned gender and gender identity. And body dysmorphic disorder is, quote, a mental health condition in which somebody can't stop thinking about one or more perceived defects or flaws in their appearance, particularly a flaw that appears minor or can't be seen by others. And with the state they were in mentally regarding their body, they were essentially taken advantage of. These people would be offered payment in exchange for their body parts, but the environment these procedures took place in were not sterile whatsoever. The methods the procedures were conducted were very amateur and dangerous, even described in court documents as, quote, a little short of human butchery, and in some cases, a little more than human butchery. Likewise, while medical equipment was used in some procedures involved the use of household implements and kitchen knives. And other ones involved use of objects designed and made to be used on livestock. A lot of these procedures had clear adult gratification overtones involved, or were just even overtly intended for adult gratification purposes. Again, speaking in code for YouTube guidelines, but I'm sure you get what I mean by that. And overall, very concerningly, a lot of the procedures caused immense distress, with some even resulting in the victims requiring immediate emergency medical attention. They used clamps in some procedures, they injected fluids, and in many of the procedures, the victims would suffer extensive blood loss. It was clear that in some of the procedures, the victims were in acute and severe pain, and one of the victims was even heard on camera saying, quote, "I do not want to die." In this case, the victim, who was referred to in documents as CN, had bleeding at his groin, and so Marius made 2 calls to 999, aka the police. When the ambulance officers arrived, Marius did not tell them what was going on. He instead told them that there had been an accident with a kitchen knife. The attending ambulance officers reported catastrophic and uncontrolled hemorrhaging, and CN was required to have emergency surgery. In another case, after 3 calls were made to 999, a victim identified as TF told the ambulance that he tried to self-circumcise, and when he was brought to the hospital, he had to be operated on under general anesthetic. Another very notable case involved a victim listed as RP, who Marius actually branded using a red hot iron to place EM, standing for Eunuch Maker, on the back of his leg. And while there are so many more cases, making matters worse was a case from December 22nd, 2017, where Marius had a case involving a 16-year-old boy. And what this case involved was the use of electrocution in the lower front area and in the back area. This child was in pain and asked him to stop as this was happening. And Marius posted this to the site online to receive money, even sending some of the profits to the child as a form of payment or reward, which, by the way, with him not being an adult, this is distribution of indecent videos or photographs of a child. And just to quickly add to this, Marius was also found to have a photo of someone engaging in adult acts with an animal. Eventually, Marius and the team were caught when that raid of the Finsbury Park home occurred in December of 2021. When in court, Marius never expressed any feelings of remorse for the crimes he had committed, nor for any of the lifelong physical and psychological harm the victims faced. He was charged in relation to 13 victims and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. This website ran for just a little over 3 years before operations ended in March of 2021. But within those 3 years of it being up, there were over 22,800 registered users from all around the world, making the site a total amount of over 300,000 pounds, which is about $410,000 US. And of this 22,800 members, Neil Hopper himself happened to be one of them. The reason Neil was suspended from his job in March of 2023 was because he had been arrested after allegations that in 2019, to profit financially, Neil had fraudulently told insurance companies that the reason for his legs being amputated was the result of sepsis from a mysterious illness. Because they alleged Neil's leg injuries weren't the result of sepsis from a mysterious illness, but rather were self-inflicted and were all part of a scheme of him trying to earn 235,622 pounds from one company and 231,031 pounds from another, for a total of about 466,000 pounds.
I've even managed to sort through a pile of old documents, which was about 2 foot tall, and sorted out some insurance claims and personal independent payment claims. I must admit, I've been in a bit of 2 minds about the whole personal independence payments and Motability and the blue badge. Half of me is, I think, in a bit of disbelief. Half of me is, and also feeling that, you know, I don't want to do it. I don't feel like I need to do it. I've got a bit of a problem with it. Lots of it not being means tested. And I can afford to live without the payments. But then there's the other half of me going, it's there, I'm entitled to it, I've paid my taxes. So yeah, it's a little bit strange. I don't think I'm morally strong enough not to take the free stuff. But it does feel like, yeah, sorry you lost your legs. Here's a bit of compensation. Here's, the government saying sorry, commiserations. But I'm sure I'll get my head around it.
On Wednesday, July 23rd, 2025, after a 2.5-year investigation by Devon and Cornwall police, Neil appeared at Cornwall Magistrates Court, where he was hit with 2 charges of fraud by false representation, as prosecutors claimed that he, quote, made a false representation to insurers, namely the injuries to his legs were the result of sepsis and were not self-inflicted. But while this was already huge news, this unfortunately wasn't all that was discovered, because through their investigation, they found out that between August 21st, 2018 and December 4th, 2020, Neil had purchased not 1, not 2, but 3 videos from eunuchmaker.com. And it was reported that throughout that time, he had been in contact with Marius, encouraging him to continue amputating body parts from other people. Because of this, Neil was also hit with a 3rd charge of encouraging or assisting the commission of grievous bodily harm. Neil did not enter any pleas, and he remained in custody until his scheduled date at the Truro Crown Court on Tuesday, August 26, 2025. During his trial, the prosecutor Nicholas Lee stated that the reason Neil's legs had to be amputated was because Neil had actually purposely frozen his legs with ice and dry ice so that they would be damaged so bad he would have to get them removed. Just to explain, frostbite is an injury caused by freezing of the skin and underlying tissues. It occurs in 3 stages, or 4 if you're counting your normal skin. There's frostnip, superficial frostbite, and deep frostbite. While frostnip is mild and doesn't cause permanent damage, deep frostbite extends into the tendons, bones, and muscles, and essentially damages and causes death to the tissue of the affected area. So damaged to the point the skin may actually turn black and rubbery, and if this damaged area becomes infected, the infection can spread into the blood, which can lead to sepsis. So the reason Neil had sepsis was because of this, and was not because of some random illness. And you want to know who he spoke to for advice on getting this done? None other than Marius Gustavson himself. Because it turns out, Marius not only performed these amputations, but he got a few amputations performed on himself. He, with the help of 3 others, removed his private part, removed part of one of his nipples, and froze his left leg, which led to amputation, which he described doing so because he apparently, quote, wanted to look like a Ken doll with nothing down there. One of the 3 who helped was actually somebody named Jacob Crimmy Appleby, who was only 17 years old at the time. His defense argued that he had been seduced by the adult Marius after falling down a rabbit hole while looking up gender dysphoria online. Neil actually had lengthy correspondence with Marius Gustavson. They had exchanged about 1,500 messages with one another. These messages mainly entailed Neil asking Marius about his own lower leg amputations, how he did it, and how much dry ice he used. In one of the messages, Neil told Marius, quote, "I've dreamt of this for 20 years. In another, he wrote, "It's going to be awesome being a double amputee." And after he got the amputations done, he sent him one saying, quote, "It feels so cool, no feet." I'm not sure what happened specifically to the charge of encouraging or assisting the commission of grievous bodily harm, as the more recent articles don't mention it, like how it was mentioned in July. However, Neil admitted to the court 2 counts of fraud and 3 counts of possessing extreme adult content, revealing that he had a, quote, interest in amputation. The judge, James Adkin, said that while Neil seemed remorseful, The level of harm in those 3 videos that he purchased from eunuchmaker.com were exceptionally high. Neil paid £10 and £35 for the 3 videos he bought from eunuchmaker.com, and all of these videos showed men willingly having their private area removed. And just to add on top of everything, those insurance claims were very large. Prosecutor Mr. Lee stated that Neil was tempted by greed, mentioning that not only did Neil enjoy the attention he was getting, but he also was caught sending a message to a friend in which he stated he should, quote, milk this as much as possible, which he did in fact do, as he used this money earned to purchase expensive luxury items, including a camper van, a hot tub, and home improvements. Lee further stated, quote, his motivations were a combination of obsession with removing parts of his own body and a sexual interest in doing so. It seems to have been a long-standing ambition of his. As for mitigation, it was explained how Neil had suffered from body dysmorphia since he was a child, with Andrew Langdon KC stating that his feet were a, quote, unwelcome extra and a persisting never-ending discomfort. While Neil stated that he didn't regret the operations, he did state that he bitterly regrets the dishonesty about their cause. He stated that after the operations, he had been, quote, totally overwhelmed by support from friends and family, which made it even more difficult to tell them what had really happened. All in all, Neil admitted fault to what he had done, and on Thursday, September 4th, 2025, he was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in prison for insurance fraud and possession of extreme adult content. When news of this broke around the end of July, a hospital trust spokesman stated, quote, the charges do not relate to Mr. Hopper's professional conduct, and there has been no evidence to suggest any risk to patients. The trust conducted, quote, comprehensive clinical reviews of surgery performed by Neil, including engaging an experienced independent clinical expert to review decisions to operate. But in doing so, they stated, quote, we want to reassure the public that our exhaustive investigations have found no evidence whatsoever to indicate any risk or harm to patients at our hospitals. Likewise, the police also stated that after working closely with the trusts, they found that none of the criminal charges related to Neil's professional conduct, and they didn't find any risks to the patients Neil treated during their investigation. However, many former patients who were treated by Neil, including people who have gotten amputations performed by him, had serious concerns that their treatment actually could have been related to Neil's charges. Mike Bird, a partner at Enable Law in South England, said that the case has caused shock and grave concern for former patients, as there are worries that they were operated on by Neil unnecessarily. Because if you think about it, he had a thing for amputations. He purchased 3 videos of people getting their privates removed for his own pleasure, and he got his legs amputated himself. Even if hypothetically all of the amputations he performed were necessary, it's hard to imagine or think about the fact that he possibly could have been getting off to doing these procedures on patients. Because of these concerns, some of his former patients had contacted the Southwest-based medical negligence firm regarding this case. That being said, there were patients who were operated on by him who didn't have concerns about their care. One of these patients included a 38-year-old man named Jason Abbott. Jason had his foot amputated by Neil in November of 2022 after experiencing pain in his ankle from arthritis, but he felt very supported about Neil's care and even was provided a lot of information by Neil so that he'd be able to make the correct decision. He was even shocked to hear about this conviction. Now, the number one question a lot of people had was, why would someone want to amputate healthy limbs? This is the title of a BBC article from September 13th, 2025. Journalist Nicola Bryan spoke to New York psychiatrist Dr. Michael First, who actually got a condition called body integrity dysphoria, or BID, added to the International Classification of Diseases. And although it wasn't made clear whether Neil received a diagnosis in court, Dr. First stated that from what he read about the case, it reminded him of what he had seen in his own patients who had BID. Because this wasn't something of very recent times, but there have been cases from before where people willingly had healthy limbs amputated. In the article, it mentions that Dr. First was first interested in the topic of BID in 1997 when he received a call from the BBC Horizon, a TV series covering science and philosophy. The series had been following a story in which two men, one from Germany and one from England, traveled to the Falkirk and District Royal Infirmary in Scotland in order for each of them to have a lower leg removed by a surgeon named Dr. Robert Smith. After this happened, the hospital ended up banning amputations of healthy limbs for psychological reasons. When Dr. First was contacted by the BBC Horizon series, he had already been in the midst of working on updating a handbook called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual to help healthcare professionals classify and diagnose mental disorders. And they asked him, like, hey, do you have any idea what condition these two men have? This was something Dr. First had never heard of before, so he began his work into figuring out what this could possibly be called. The first description of this condition was published in a 1972 magazine called Penthouse, in which a series of letters were written by people who wanted to become amputees for their own pleasure. The first scientific report putting the name to this was published in 1977 by John Money et al., in which a condition called apopmenophilia was used to describe the desire of somebody wanting to become an amputee, and acrotomophilia was used to describe someone who had a strong desire for being with an amputee for their pleasure. After discovering this term, one day, Dr. First received a phone call, and when he answered, there was a man on the other line telling him, hey, I have healthy limbs, but I really would like to get them amputated. Is there a diagnosis for this so I'm actually able to go ahead with getting a surgical amputation? It was from this conversation where Dr. First learned that this very man was essentially a ringleader for an entire community of people who were actually wanting to get an amputation. The man wanted to help get the condition added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual so that he could actually present to a surgeon with a real condition explaining why he wants the amputation. And Dr. First was very interested in looking into this. Soon enough, Dr. First was put in contact with 52 other people who also wanted their limbs removed or who wanted to become paralyzed. And upon interviewing all of the individuals, Dr. First realized that the main motivation for many wasn't for pleasure, but was rather to, quote, fulfill this sense that they're in the wrong body. These were very regular people who just lived with this obsession with most keeping it a secret and not being able to tell their loved ones because of the shame that could come with it. From his research, he discovered as a form of relief, it was very common for people to pretend they were an amputee by either tying up their limbs or using a wheelchair. And from what he's seen, the condition always begins when the person's a child, with people either being born with it or having a predisposition for it, but nobody getting it past the age of 13. Some that he had spoken to said that they had it for all they could remember, while others said there was an exact moment that triggered it. For example, he described, quote, somebody told me this story that when he was in primary school, a classmate of his became an amputee in a swimming accident and came back to school after getting his amputation and became like the hero, the most popular kid, and everybody's fascinated. So this guy is seeing that, and it was the point where he wanted to be an amputee. It sort of planted this in his head, and it lasted for the rest of his life. Also, not everybody wanted the same thing done. Some wanted one leg amputated, some both, some wanted arms, some fingers, some wanted to be paraplegic. He even had a case where someone wanted to be blind and actually used acid to blind themselves. But what was common amongst everyone was that they all lived in agony and suffered extreme mental anguish. Some even wanted to end their lives because of how much it consumed their mind. While he wasn't able to collect enough data for body integrity dysmorphia to meet the threshold to add it to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, he was able to get it added to the International Classification of Diseases. Just a quick note from the editing room, as I was filming towards the end, I kept on saying body integrity dysmorphia, but I meant to say body integrity dysphoria. So every time I say body integrity dysmorphia, just keep in mind, I mean to say body integrity dysphoria, also known as body integrity identity disorder. There are also debates amongst researchers on the type of condition it is, as Dr. First believes it's a psychiatric condition, whereas other researchers believe it's neurological, meaning it would have something to do with malfunction or damage to the nervous system. As for treating it, Dr. First said that since a lot of people with it are depressed, using antidepressants would help treat the depression, but that wouldn't take away their desire of being an amputee, so they'd still be suffering mental anguish. That being said, even though the patients aren't psychotic, he did see small success with using antipsychotics to treat patients. Otherwise, the only known treatment that was successful in getting rid of one's mental anguish was amputation. That just comes with a load of ethical concerns because it's just not a reversible procedure. And Dr. First described, quote, "I don't know of any case of somebody who's had an amputation and then regretted it, but the people who had it and regret are maybe not talking because they feel so bad about the fact they did it, so it's very distorted." While the condition is believed to be rare, there's probably a good chunk of people living or who lived with it who haven't spoken out because of the shame and secrecy associated with it. But nonetheless, it's a condition that exists all over the world, and many people might just be, quote, "suffering in silence." Take this case from Taiwan from January 2023, for example. A 23-year-old university student in Taiwan identified by the last name Zhang also used dry ice to freeze his feet for more than 10 hours, getting them to the point where they needed amputation. He also submitted insurance claims totaling 41.26 million new Taiwan dollars, which is approximately 1.4 million US dollars. He and his friend who helped ended up getting caught the next year in March of 2024. From what I saw from his social media pages, interviews, and everything, Neil did seem very keen with the attention he got from being an amputee. I mean, within just months of the procedure, he had such a brand identity centered around being a surgeon who was an amputee. He called himself the bionic surgeon, set up a Facebook, a Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and even a website, making sure he set his brand up perfectly, which for patients isn't a bad thing. Like, I shared and continue sharing my story of being diagnosed with cancer and having avascular necrosis, and there are so many other people who do the same. Thing is, it wasn't a choice to have cancer or avascular necrosis. My story and other people's stories are very truthful through and through. So to immediately start off with this whole lie is extremely deceitful. He stated, quote, "My life is more interesting because of what's happened to me." And it was even clear how much of a fan he was of other social media content creators who were amputees and posted about their life as one. Particularly on his website and even in some of his YouTube video descriptions, he shouts out Footless Joe and a guy named Ken who went by Left-Legged Warrior.
I will do a video at some point about the differences in expectations and achievements, and the dangers of the internet, because certainly there are people, YouTubers, Instagrammers, etc., who are just achievement pornography. They just do everything, and amputation is a minor encumbrance in their amazing lifestyles. And then there are another group of people who are quite active online who are completely dismissive, who completely can't cope, who fail, who revel in the agony and the pain and the disabledness of being an amputee. I'm sort of hoping that I can hit the middle ground. You know, it's not easy being an amputee, not at all, but also it's not too bad. You know, I'm a double amputee and I'm coping, and you know, I just hope that if there's somebody out there I can help along and get through this to make people realize that it's not great, but it's not that bad either.
So it's clear he really wanted to be a part of this niche, if you will, and studied what these creators were doing so he could do it himself. I just feel like there almost could have been more merit if he stayed true to himself, and instead of creating this fake story, he could have maybe raised awareness for body integrity dysmorphia. This story was the first time I've ever heard of it, and I would have been so interested to learn about somebody speaking about their experience of dealing with this and raising awareness so maybe more people dealing with it could speak out about it. That being said, I do understand that there is potential judgment people would receive for having a condition like this because it isn't well known. And truthfully, a lot of the time when people do have some kind of body dysmorphia or related condition, people are harsh towards them, especially because some people don't believe that conditions like these are even real, and they might accuse the person of faking their disorder. But there are creators who have rare mental health conditions that share their story and have a fan base of people who are supportive and very interested in their content. For example, this is obviously a different condition, but I've watched a few videos of people who have dissociative identity disorder, or DID, which is another rare mental health condition, and I'm always very interested in hearing and learning more about it. Had Neil got on here and started off a video straight up like, "My name is Neil and I want to have my legs amputated," I would be sad. Like, I would want to watch that. But I guess that's where the whole shame and secrecy of body integrity dysmorphia comes, because he probably thought he would be judged for sharing something like that. Whereas if he just happened to suffer a traumatic illness that left him no choice but to amputate his legs, there's absolutely no way he's getting judged for that. And maybe he really just wanted to get his legs amputated, so he knew if he did say he had body integrity dysmorphia, he wouldn't be able to get it done. Also, it hasn't been made clear on whether Neil received a diagnosis. I know in one of the articles, the defense said that he had body dysphoria, but in another article, it says that he wasn't diagnosed. So I'm not too sure if he actually was diagnosed, but considering he dug deep enough into the internet to find eunuchmaker.com, I'm sure he could have dug into some research and studies that have mentioned the condition and maybe even spoken to a psychiatrist or some mental health professional to get help with it first before going to the extreme. In addition to just straight up lying, I think where Neil especially messed up was just how greedy he was. Like, he got the amputation done, but then he wanted the attention. And to add to that, he wanted the money. To make such a large insurance claim knowing that it was self-inflicted, like, that's just too much. And we can't even talk about all of this without talking about eunuchmaker.com. 3 videos he purchased of men who likely could have been very vulnerable people getting their private area removed in deplorable conditions. And to add on top of that, he was an amputation surgeon. Like, these are obviously 2 very different scenarios, but to put it in perspective, think of somebody who purchases indecent videos of children and then working as a pediatrician. Absolutely not. I wouldn't want someone to perform a procedure like that on me if I knew they get off to it. Like, that's just weird. Likewise, I get it might be embarrassing to tell your family and friends that you wanted to get your limbs amputated, but should your embarrassment outweigh the stress they faced on whether you'd be okay or whether you are okay? Because regarding his wife, he said, quote, "This didn't happen to me, it happened to us." And he even stated, quote, "The physical changes in my body were fairly easy to understand, but what I didn't understand were the psychological changes and how hard it was just to fit back into family life." To know how much impact this would have on your family, to even lie to them is just not right. As for any money Neil received from the fraud, the Crown Prosecution Service said it would be making an application under the Proceeds of Crime Act in order to recover it. So hopefully that gets sorted out. And I guess Neil will have 2 years and 8 months in jail to reflect on everything he has done and hopefully make some changes. If you are a patient of Neil Hopper's and have any concerns of the treatment you received from him, I'd like to refer you to this very brief article published by Enable law partner Mike Bird with some advice regarding some of the options you might have. But yes, that is it for this video. What are your thoughts on this story? Have you heard about body integrity dysmorphia before? Are you suspicious about Neil's conduct working with patients while doing this behind closed doors? Have you heard about Eunuch Maker? What are your thoughts on that? Please comment your thoughts below and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any other videos on medical cases, crime, and mysteries. Bye now.